The topic of this lecture is real estate brokers. If the owner of real property wants to sell that property, the owner may begin the process by contacting a broker to assist and facilitate in the sale of the property. There are several types of brokers that may be involved in the land sale transaction. The first is the listing broker. The listing broker is the broker who enters into an agreement directly with the seller. There are several different types of listing agreements that may be made. The first is the exclusive listing, which has two types. The first type of exclusive listing is the exclusive agency contract. In this agreement, the broker is the only agent who represents the seller, and the broker will receive a commission unless the seller finds his own purchaser. The second type of exclusive listing is the exclusive right to sell. Once again, the broker is the only agent representing the seller. However, in this type of listing, the broker receives a commission even if the seller finds a purchaser on his own or through another broker. So the exclusive right to sell tends to be very favorable to the broker. The second type of listing agreement is the non-exclusive or open agreement. In a non-exclusive agreement, the seller may use more than one broker, and the broker earns a commission only if the broker is the first person to secure a suitable buyer at suitable terms. So the non-exclusive or open listing tends to be more favorable to the seller. Whether the listing is exclusive or non-exclusive, the listing broker will have a number of responsibilities. The primary responsibility is, of course, marketing the property for sale. In marketing the property, the broker will advertise the property, will hold open houses, and may list the property with an MLS, which is a multiple listing service. A multiple listing service is a cooperative agreement among brokers and appraisers. The brokers and appraisers pay a fee for the privilege of accessing a database which is populated by information shared by the members. On the MLS, a wealth of information can be found. The listing may include photographs of the property, square footage, lot size, number of rooms, number of bathrooms, asking price, and location. To see an example of something that's like an MLS, take a look online at a site such as Zillow, Zillow, which contains a lot of the information that I just described. As I mentioned before, the listing broker will receive a commission, which by tradition is 6%, and the broker gets that commission if traditionally the broker secures a buyer who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property at a price that's acceptable to the seller. We'll discuss the broker's recovery of her commission a little later in this lecture. The next type of broker is the selling broker. The selling broker is the person who works closely with the potential buyer. Usually the potential buyer will contact the selling broker looking for assistance in locating and securing property to buy. However, the selling broker does not actually execute an agreement directly with the buyer or with the seller. The selling broker has a number of responsibilities, which will include, of course, helping the potential buyer locate suitable and affordable real estate. The selling broker is usually compensated by sharing in the commission that the seller pays to the listing broker. As I just mentioned, the selling broker does not enter into an agreement directly with the buyer. Because the selling broker doesn't make an agreement with the buyer, the selling broker will not have a fiduciary responsibility to the buyer, which, as we'll see in our discussion of fiduciary responsibilities below, can create problems for the buyer. So the buyer may wish to engage a buyer's broker. The buyer's broker will make an agreement directly with the buyer, and under that agreement, the buyer's broker will have a number of responsibilities. The buyer's broker will research listings and will try to target listings that are in the buyer's geographic area and, of course, fit the buyer's price range. The buyer's broker will show properties to the buyer, will help arrange inspections of the property, may assist in preparing offers and counteroffers, and may even assist the buyer in the escrow process. When it comes to compensation, the buyer's broker may be compensated in one of two ways. The buyer's broker may share in the listing broker's commission. However, the buyer's broker may also receive a fee that's paid by the buyer directly to the buyer's broker. The last type of broker that we're going to discuss is the transaction broker. The transaction broker is a newer type of broker who provides a limited form of representation to a buyer or a seller, or very likely to both. The transaction broker is recognized in Florida. And in fact, in Florida, a broker is presumed to be a transaction broker unless the parties agree otherwise. The transaction broker has limited responsibilities, as I mentioned before. However, the broker must deal honestly and fairly with the parties, has to account for funds between the parties, has to use skill, care, and diligence in the transaction, and must disclose all known facts that materially affect the value of the residential real property and that are not readily observable to the buyer, as we'll discuss in later lectures, and must present all offers and counteroffers in a timely manner, unless a party has previously directed otherwise in writing. The transaction broker may also limit his responsibilities through the agreement he makes with the parties. The key to the transaction broker is that the transaction broker is not considered to be a fiduciary. However, there is very limited confidentiality. Under this confidentiality, the transaction broker may not disclose certain things. First of all, the transaction broker cannot disclose to the buyer that the seller is willing to accept a price that's less than the asking or listed price. Second, the transaction broker may not disclose to the seller that the buyer is willing to pay a price that's greater than was submitted in a written offer. Third, the transaction broker cannot disclose that the buyer or the seller has a motivation for buying or selling the property. And finally, the transaction broker may not disclose that the seller or the buyer will agree to financial terms that are different from those that have been offered. In addition, the transaction broker must also not disclose any other information that the buyer or the seller has requested to remain confidential. And as I mentioned before, it's very important to note that the transaction broker is not deemed to be a fiduciary. Now that we've identified the types of brokers, let's take a closer look at the agency status of those brokers. We'll begin with the listing broker. As you'll recall, the listing broker makes an agreement directly with the seller. Therefore, the listing broker is an agent of the seller. The second type of broker is the selling broker. Traditionally, the selling broker is a sub-agent of the seller because the seller pays the selling broker's commission. This fact oftentimes surprises buyers. Remember, a buyer will go to a selling agent in an attempt to receive assistance in purchasing property. However, despite the fact that the buyer makes the contact with the selling broker is not traditionally an agent of the buyer, but instead is an agent of the seller. However, in a minority of jurisdictions, the selling broker is now deemed to be an agent of a buyer, even if an MLS service is used. The next type of broker is the buyer's broker. Remember that the buyer's broker makes an agreement directly with the buyer, and therefore the buyer's broker is an agent of the buyer. The final type of broker that we discussed is the transaction broker. And by statute, the transaction broker is not the agent of either the buyer or the seller. It is possible that the buyer and seller may engage the same broker, so the question of dual agency may arise. Some states do permit dual agency if the broker reveals the dual agency status to and receives permission from both the buyer and the seller. However, Florida does not permit dual agency because, as I mentioned before, Florida has the category of transaction broker that takes the place of dual agency. The next issue is the fiduciary responsibility of the broker. As I discussed before, by statute, a transaction broker is not considered to be a fiduciary. However, the other brokers that we discussed, the listing broker, the selling broker, and the buyer's broker, are all deemed to be fiduciaries. As a fiduciary, the broker must deal with the principal in good faith. In exercising this responsibility of good faith, the broker must do a number of things. First of all, the broker must avoid self-dealing, which means that the broker may not buy the property for herself, unless, of course, the principal has consented after full, fair, and prompt disclosure. The Licari case, which is included in the casebook on page 530, discusses the problems that arise when a broker engages in self-dealing. Second, under the duty of good faith, the broker must always follow the principal's instructions. And third, if the broker is a selling broker, the broker must report to the seller any information that the buyer reports to the broker. This particular fact may surprise the buyer. You'll recall that a buyer may approach a selling broker for assistance in securing real property. If the buyer tells the selling broker that the buyer is willing to pay, for example, more than the list price, the selling broker must report that information to the seller. Second, the broker owes a duty of due care to the principal. In exercising this duty of due care, the broker must explain to the principal the terms of the sale contract. The broker must also prepare accurate financial statements. And once again, if the broker is a selling broker, the broker must advise the seller about the financial stability of the buyer. So once again, if the buyer contacts a selling broker for assistance in securing property, and the buyer reveals to the selling broker that the buyer is financially strapped, the selling broker must pass this negative information about the buyer along to the seller. In addition, the broker has a duty to disclose certain information to the principal. If the principal is the seller, and the broker is an agent of the seller, the broker must disclose to the seller information the broker possesses that's pertinent to the sale. This information will include self-dealing, all offers, and, as I mentioned before, information concerning the financial instability of the buyer. If the principal is the buyer, in many states, the broker must disclose to the buyer material defects in the property that are known to the broker and not known to the buyer. And in some jurisdictions, such as California, the broker must also inspect the premises for defects. If the broker breaches her fiduciary duty either intentionally or negligently, the broker may be liable for damages. There are several different measures of damages that may be used. The first is the contract's measure, beginning with expectation. Some jurisdictions do use the traditional benefit of the bargain or expectation measure for breach of the broker's fiduciary duty. This breach then will be measured by the difference between the value expected and the value actually received. And in a few jurisdictions, such as California, the non-breaching party may also recover lost profits plus incidental damages and out-of-pocket costs. The second type of contract measure that may be used is the reliance measure. Under this measure, the non-breaching party will receive the difference between the amount paid and the value actually received. The third measure is restitution. In some cases, such as the Licari case that I just mentioned in the casebook, the court will order the broker to make restitution of profits gained by the broker as a result of the breach. Some courts may also permit the non-breaching party to receive a tort measure of damages. If the plaintiff's complaint contains elements of tort, or if the broker has acted in bad faith, then tort compensatory damages may be awarded. These damages may include pain and suffering, and in the appropriate case, punitive damages. The final issue we'll discuss is the broker's recovery of her commission. There are two sets of rules for recovery of commission, depending on whether the recovery is in the absence of or in the face of a breach of fiduciary duty. We'll start with the rule for the absence of a breach of fiduciary duty. Under the traditional rule, the broker is entitled to recover her commission if she produces a buyer who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property, and the seller and buyer execute a contract of sale. In that case, the commission is generally paid at closing from the sale proceeds. And under this traditional rule, the broker receives her commission even if the sale fails to close. However, if the sale fails to close, the broker may choose to forego the commission so that she can maintain a good relationship with her principal. Under the minority rule, the broker does not receive a commission if the sale is not completed because the buyer backed out. But even under this minority rule, the broker will receive the commission if the seller backs out in bad faith. If there is a breach of fiduciary duty on the part of the broker, then we must distinguish between an intentional breach and a negligent breach. If the broker breaches the agreement intentionally, the broker may not recover his commission. If the breach is negligent, however, a court may permit the broker to recover her commission if the breach is simply negligent and made without bad faith. But if the court permits recovery for a negligent breach, the broker's recovery will be offset by any damages that have been caused by the negligent breach. This is the end of this lecture on real estate brokers.